The Battle of Wauhatchie. Night attacks are specially valuable against troops who have been defeated and are retreating. They are of little value under any other circumstances. The war, too, had now reached a stage where men had become impossible to replace in the Confederate ranks. Nothing could be more injudicious than to sacrifice them, even for a success which would have no effect upon the campaign. That was the case in this instance. Near at hand, the Federals had double or treble the force of the Confederates, and the camp to be attacked was 2 miles within the Federal lines. The attack must be made, the fruit of it be gathered, and withdrawal accomplished before the light of dawn, for with the dawn, or even before it, an overwhelming force of the enemy would cut off the withdrawal. The only troops available for the attack were 4 brigades of Hood's division under Jenkins, which had been brought around the high toe of Lookout Mountain. This road was exposed to batteries on the north side of the river and could only be used at night. 3 of the brigades, Law, Benning, and Robertson, had suffered severely, both at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, and scarcely averaged 700 men each. These brigades were ordered to cross Lookout Creek and seize the road between Hooker's camp near Brown's Ferry and the camp of Geary to be attacked. The remaining brigade was Jenkins's own, now under Bratton, and was about 1,800 strong. Law, with 2 regiments, had opposed Hazen's landing on the 27th and skirmished on the 28th with the advance of the 11th and 12th Corps under Hooker, but had now withdrawn across Lookout Creek. From the mountains above, a fine view was afforded of the valley with Hooker's camp at the north end and Geary's 3 miles behind it. Jenkins had been summoned before sundown to view it and get some idea of the topography. He returned after dark, and joining Law discussed the enterprise, which Law strongly advised against. The orders, however, were peremptory, and there was no superior at hand to appeal to. The moon was about full, and soon after dark Law moved with his brigade across the bridge, and after some time spent in exploration, took position on a ridge nearly parallel to the road between Brown's Ferry and Wauhatchie, and some 50 to 150 yards distant. It was about 2 miles below the camp of Geary's division, and less than a mile above the encampments of the 11th and 12th Corps. The Texas Brigade reporting to Law, he placed 2 of its regiments on his left and 1 on his right, and sent the 4th Regiment to hold the bridge in his rear. Benning's brigade was sent to ambush the road farther ahead. This effort to hold the road against efforts to reinforce Geary might have been much more effective had Law thrown his brigades boldly across the road, with perhaps 2 brigades in his front line supported by the 3rd in a second line. He probably failed to adopt this policy only because he was too conscious of his weakness. His retreat was more assured and easier from the position which he took, and in view of the risks attendant on the venture and the small chances of success, it may have been the more prudent course. In the placing of Law's command, there had been a few picket shots about 10 o'clock, which had caused Geary's command to be put under arms and to be unusually alert. Soon after midnight, their own picket challenged and was shot down, upon which the camp was alarmed, all lights extinguished, and the troops formed in line. The weather was somewhat cloudy, making the moonlight fitful. Jenkins endeavoured to restrain his men from firing as they deployed before the camp, but it was in vain, and gradually the regiments extending on each side overlapped the Federal line and awaited an attack on the Federal rear by Later Col T.M. Logan, with a force of sharpshooters who had passed around to the rear. Their attack was to be a signal for a general charge. About an hour had now elapsed. It was just at this juncture that Jenkins gave orders to withdraw. Law had notified him that the enemy had passed his position, which was a mistake. The road had been open all the while, but no. Troops had passed. On the opening of the attack upon Geary, there had been a general alarm in all the camps below, and several brigades had been ordered to go to his relief. The 1st Brigade passing Law's ambush received volleys which, in the darkness, did little harm but threw their lines into confusion. Forming then parallel to the road, the Federals charged Law's position, but were at first repulsed. Reforming and extending their lines, Steinwehr's division made a second attempt, but Smith's brigade, which struck Law's front, was again repulsed with heavy loss. The men, however, did not on this occasion fall back to the foot of the hill, but rallied in the darkness of the woods near at hand, until a part of the 136th NY, which had overlapped Law's front, had appeared in his rear. The attack being then renewed was successful all along the line, and Law fell back toward the bridge, not being pursued. Robertson, who had had 8 casualties, and Benning, who had had none, also withdrew, as the retreat of Law compelled. Meanwhile, in the confusion of the night, a column of 2 Federal brigades, ordered to go directly to Geary's help, had halted without orders and was overlooked for nearly 2 hours. Owing to this oversight and the non-pursuit of Law, both he and Jenkins were able to cross the bridge before daylight. No artillery was used by the Confederates, but Knaps's battery of 4 guns, with Geary, was severely engaged at close quarters, expending 224 rounds and losing 3 killed and 19 wounded. Geary's total casualties were 34 killed, 174 wounded, 8 missing, total 216. These all occurred in Green's and Cobham's brigades, about 1,600 strong. The Federal casualties in the brigades opposing Law were 45 killed, 150 wounded, 7 missing, total 204. These occurred principally in Tyndale's and Orland Smith's brigades. The aggregate was 420. The Confederate casualties reported are as follows: Law, 3 killed, 19 wounded, 30 missing, total 52. Jenkins, 31 killed, 286 wounded, 39 missing, total 356. Aggregate 408. The character of the attack by Jenkins's brigade and of the defence by Green's and Cobham's, aided by the battery, had been excellent. The casualties were heavy and included many officers distinguished among their comrades for conduct. Nothing less could have been expected, and nothing materially more could be hoped for, and such considerations should have forbidden this adventure. The guarding of the rear by Law proved a success, though due to a Federal mistake, not to his disposition. Only about half his force was engaged. It repulsed 2 attacks, but was swept away by the 3rd. The enemy, however, made no advance, and a free road, left open until after daylight, provided an escape for all 4 brigades from one of the most foolhardy adventures of the war. A court of inquiry in the 11th Corps was held, which found that Krasizanovsky's brigade had halted without authority and against the orders of the division commander when under orders to go to Geary's assistance. These operations left Rosecrans with free communications by the shortest and best roads, and at liberty to receive all the reinforcements coming to him. Besides the 11th and 12th Corps, under Hooker, already near at hand, it was known that Grant was bringing up a large force under Sherman from Memphis, and it was clear that within 30 days a force would be concentrated against us sufficient to overwhelm us. Rosecrans had now converted Chattanooga into a citadel, impregnable to assault by storm, within which he could confidently await the accumulation of whatever force was needed. The burden of the attack was upon us. We must promptly take the aggressive and meet and defeat either Grant and Sherman approaching from the west, or Burnside near at hand and threatening on the east, and be able then to reconcentrate our army against the other adversaries. President Davis had recently paid a visit to the army, which, it was known, was dissatisfied with Bragg as a commander, but after some investigation had decided to sustain him. Bragg, accordingly, had the decision of the question what should be done. On November 3, he issued orders for Longstreet's corps, with Wheeler's cavalry, to attack Burnside's corps at Knoxville, which was to be assailed at the same time by a force of perhaps 4,000 men under Ransom, coming from southwest Virginia. With the remainder of his army, Bragg proposed to hold his present lines, in front of Chattanooga, during the absence of Longstreet's division. As these lines occupied a concave front of fully 8 miles against an enemy concentrated within 4, they were necessarily weak and unable to quickly reinforce threatened points. Longstreet pointed out their disadvantages and urged a withdrawal of the remainder of the army to a strong defensive position behind the Chickamauga River, and that his own force for the attack of Burnside at Knoxville should be increased to 20,000 men to ensure quick and easy work, and save any dependence upon the hypothetical force from southwest Virginia. Bragg, however, overruled all suggestions, and Longstreet was put in motion on November 4 for Knoxville, with Wheeler's 2 divisions, 4 brigades of cavalry. The result was what might have been expected, and we may anticipate and record it briefly before following Longstreet in his adventure against Knoxville. The Battle of Chattanooga or Missionary Ridge. On October 22. Grant had reached Chattanooga and superseded Rosecrans. By November 20, he had concentrated at Chattanooga about 65,000 infantry and artillery present for duty, and provided siege artillery for the forts about Chattanooga. Bragg, meanwhile, had further reduced his force by sending Bushrod Johnson with 2 brigades, 2,500 men, to Knoxville, who joined Longstreet just too late to be of any service. This had reduced his force to about 40,000 infantry present for duty, greatly handicapped by their position in the long concave exterior line. On November 22, Grant took the aggressive and set on foot attacks upon Bragg's extreme right and flanks. On the morning of the 24th, Hooker turned the extreme left flank at Wauhatchie, in the valley of Lookout Creek, by climbing the slope of Lookout Mountain to the foot of the palisade. This palisade is a precipice dividing the top of the mountain from the slopes forming its toe. These were held by 1 brigade of Bragg's infantry, who were advanced some distance down the slope. Advancing along the foot of the precipice, he took the Confederate positions on the toe of the mountain in reverse. They were also exposed to artillery fire from the front across the river, and were thus surely driven out, about as fast as Hooker's men could pick their way along the steep slopes at the foot of the precipice, which bounded the mountain on the west. 10 miles away on the right flank, Chickamauga Creek emptied into the Tennessee by 2 mouths, and, in the eastern mouth of the creek, Grant had concealed a number of pontoons, and behind the hills north of the river was Sherman with over 3 divisions. On the morning of November 24th, a bridge was built across the Tennessee, and 12,000 men were brought across and made a lodgment on the east end of Missionary Ridge before Bragg was aware of it. At sunrise on the 25th, both Hooker and Sherman were ordered to attack. When Hooker advanced, it was discovered that during the night of the 24th, the Confederate forces had abandoned Lookout Mountain and withdrawn all of their men across Chattanooga Creek, burning the bridge. Hooker followed in pursuit with 3 divisions, Osterhaus's, Crew's, and Geary's, about 10,000 men. About 4 hours were lost in rebuilding the bridge. Beyond it, only a feeble resistance was developed near Rossville on the western extremity of Missionary Ridge by 2 regiments of Stuart's division. Stevenson's division, which had held Lookout Mountain, had been transferred during the night to the extreme right to oppose Sherman. Hooker placed Osterhaus on the right of the ridge, Crew on the ridge, which, being narrow, he occupied with 3 lines, and Geary on the left or front of the ridge. In this formation, he advanced almost unopposed, and with slight loss until he connected about sundown with Johnson's division of the 14th Corps, which had formed a part of Thomas's attack upon the centre in the afternoon, as will presently be described. Sherman had had the entire day of the 24th practically unmolested to establish himself on the northern extremity of Missionary Ridge, and reinforcements from Chattanooga had reached him in the afternoon. Soon after sunrise on the 25th, he moved to the attack. A wide depression in the ridge separated the portion of it which he occupied from that held by Bragg. Here, during the afternoon and night, Hardee had entrenched Cleburne's division and prepared to make a desperate stand. Sherman's men, fresh from Vicksburg, attacked with great vigour, and being repulsed, renewed the attack several times with no better success. Sherman, in his report, denies that they were repulsed, but says, "Not so. The real attacking columns of General Corse, Colin Loomis, and General Smith were not repulsed. They engaged in a close struggle all day, persistently, stubbornly, and well." This is one way of stating it. Their charges were all driven back, with losses more or less severe, to the nearest places affording cover. From these they kept up musketry fire, with little loss or execution, all the rest of the day. Some reinforcements sent on the flanks did similarly, and before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Sherman's whole force had been fought to a standstill, and Cleburne held his position intact and with very little fighting the rest of the day. But Grant's third attack, the one upon the centre, was yet to be made. It was to be upon Missionary Ridge, and the topography requires some description. The ridge is here an average of some 200 feet high, with steep slopes, averaging on each side fully 500 yards wide. Many ravines and swales intersect the surface, which had been wooded but was now recently cleared, leaving many stumps. When the position was first occupied, a line of breastworks had been built at the foot of the slopes, between 1.5 and 2 miles from the Federal lines. Later, some unfinished breastworks were erected halfway up the hill. The Confederate engineers now seemed at a loss to decide exactly where to make their final stand, and only at the last did they decide to make it at the proper place, at the top of the hill. But with it they made the fatal mistake of dividing their forces, already too small, and putting one half in their skirmish line, at the bottom of the hill, and the other half at the top. Very few of the Confederate reports of this battle have been preserved, but many interesting details are given in papers led by General Manigault of SC, who commanded a brigade in Hindman's division. The construction of the works was only begun on the 23rd, with a very insufficient supply of tools. The ground was hard and rocky, and when the assault was made on the 25th, the trenches were but half completed and only afforded protection to the lower part of the body. The Confederate engineer who laid it out had orders to locate the line upon the highest ground and blindly obeyed. At many places this left numerous approaches, up ravines and swales, entirely covered from the fire of the breastworks. Manigault persuaded the engineer, who complained of having too much to do, to allow him to lay out his own line, and at such places he located the line below the crest so as to sweep the whole approach. Brigades to the right and left did not do this, and there were many places where an assaulting column could approach within a short distance without receiving any fire. The fatal mistake of dividing the force seems to have been decided on during the night of the 24th, for it was not done until the morning of the 25th. One half of each brigade was then sent to the line at the foot of the hill, and the remainder to the line at the top. This disposition of forces was made in all the troops on the ridge, and the number available gave, in each position, only a single rank, with the men about 1 pace apart. Private instructions were given the superior officers, if attacked by more than a single line of battle, to await the enemy's approach within 200 yards, then to deliver their fire, and retire to the works above. This was an injudicious order, as will be seen, impracticable of successful execution after the enemy had gotten that near in such large force. About noon, the enemy began to form in masses in front of our centre, about 2 miles away. About 2 o'clock, these masses deployed and formed 2 lines of battle, with a front of at least 2.5 miles. After completing their arrangements, these moved within a mile of our lower works and halted. Behind these 2 lines, a reserve force, apparently equal in number to one of them, was disposed at intervals in close columns of regiments and followed them some 300 yards in rear. The whole array was preceded by a powerful line of skirmishers deployed at half distances. One could not but be struck with the order and regularity of the movements and the ease with which the Federals preserved their lines. The sight was a grand and impressive one, the like of which had never been seen before by anyone who witnessed it. Manigault writes, "I felt no fear for the result, even though the arrangements to repel the attack were not such as I liked, neither did I know at the time that a column of the enemy was at that moment on our left flank and rear, or that our army numbered so few men. I think, however, that I noticed some nervousness among my men as they beheld this grand military spectacle, and I heard remarks which showed that some uneasiness existed, and that they magnified the host in their view to at least double their number." The reference made to the column of the enemy at that moment on our left flank and rear is to the 3 divisions under Hooker, advancing from Rossville on both sides of Missionary Ridge. They were due to reach the field about sundown. For some time after the last halt of the enemy, there was an ominous silence over the whole field, except for an occasional distant cannon shot. Sherman's battle, from 1 to 2 miles to the right, had been fought out. Hooker was marching cautiously unopposed, and, by a sort of tacit understanding, even the skirmishers in front paused in contemplation of the coming storm. The attack on the Confederate centre was assigned to Thomas, who had been in readiness all the morning, but was still delayed by Grant, who hesitated to order it until either Sherman had turned our right flank or Hooker had turned our left. Hooker was delayed and does not seem to have been heard from. Sherman had been fought to a standstill, but thinking that he saw reinforcements moving from the Confederate centre against Sherman, Grant directed Thomas to give the signal. It was 12 guns fired by the enemy, and was followed by the opening of their whole line, and soon after by our own guns from Missionary Ridge directed at the dark masses of their troops. The effect of a plunging fire, however, from our high elevation, was distinctly less than it would have been upon a plain, and when the enemy's lines were set in motion, which soon followed, it was apparent, at a glance, that our artillery was utterly inadequate to the task of stopping the great force before us. Meanwhile, 1/2 of the whole Confederate force was under secret orders to retreat when the enemy arrived within 200 yards, and the enemy's generals were themselves under orders from Grant not to advance beyond our skirmish line. Manigault thus describes what took place. When the enemy had arrived within about 200 yards, our men gave their volley, and a well-directed and fatal one it proved, but then followed a scene of confusion rarely witnessed and only equalled at a later hour on that day. The order had been issued to retire, but many did not hear it, owing to the reports of their own pieces and the deafening roar of artillery. Others supposed their comrades flying and refused to do likewise. Some feared to retire up the hill, exposed to a heavy fire in their rear, feeling certain, as their movements must be slow, that they would be killed or wounded before reaching their friends above. All order was lost, and each striving to save himself took the shortest direction for the summit. The enemy, seeing the confusion and retreat, moved up their first line at a double quick, and came over the breastworks. But I could see some of our brave fellows firing into the enemy's faces, and at last falling overpowered. The troops from below at last reached the works exhausted and breathless, the greater portion so demoralized that they rushed to the rear to place the ridge itself between them and the enemy. It required the utmost efforts of myself and other officers to prevent this, which we finally succeeded in doing. Many fell, broken down from overexertion, and became deathly sick or fainted. I noticed some instances of slight hemorrhage, and it was 15 minutes before the nervous systems of those men were so restored as to be able to draw a trigger with steadiness. In the meantime, Grant had observed the battle from his commanding position in the rear. As above said, he thought he had seen Bragg detaching troops from his centre opposite Thomas and sending them to reinforce the right opposite Sherman, and many Federal reports ever since have fallen into the same error. But all are wrong. Sherman had been fought to a standstill, and Cleburne had no need for reinforcements. Also, Thomas's preparations could be seen too plainly. So the elaborate strategy, which had sent Sherman to turn Bragg's right, came to naught at the fighting point. Grant had seen, with much satisfaction, the Confederate lower line of entrenchments in the possession of his forces. But as he looked, he was surprised to see, at a number of points, that his men had not halted as he had ordered, but were beginning to climb the slope and advance against the fortified line at the crest. He asked angrily, "Who ordered those men up the hill?" and, when all present disclaimed it, said, "Someone will suffer for it if it turns out badly." But the men themselves, having reached the designated position, were able to take a more practical view of it than the general himself at a distance. It would be impossible for the troops to remain in the new position under the fire of the Confederate line at the top of the hill. There was nothing to do but to follow the fugitives and endeavour to mingle with them. As the pursuers advanced, they soon appreciated the fact that the ravines and swales afforded more or less protection from fire, and the whole line soon divided and concentrated itself on about 6 separate lines of advance. Not one of these was on the front held by Manigault's brigade. Every attempted advance here had been met with fire, before which it either fell back to cover or disappeared to the right or left. Next on the left was Patton Anderson's brigade of Mississippians, and next on the right was Diaz's brigade of Alabamians. A large number of Federals soon found shelter behind some overhanging rocks in Diaz's front within 20 yards of his line of battle. Manigault turned a gun upon them, and they were driven from view, but beyond a turn of the rock they got a lodgment in large numbers, so that the division commander called for and took Manigault's largest regiment to reinforce Diaz. Meanwhile, an officer from the left reported that the enemy had broken the Miss Brigade, and, going to the left to get a view, Manigault saw the Federals in possession of the Miss, battery and the brigade retreating in disorder. The Federals soon turned the captured guns upon his line, enfilading a portion of it, and about the same time the Alabamians on the right also gave way. His own men on the flanks were still fighting well, but the centre, the part being enfiladed, even now wavering, would soon melt away. A ridge some 500 yards to the rear offered favourable ground for a rally, and, seeing that all was lost and to check the fugitives impossible, he commanded a retreat, directing the officers to rally the men upon that ridge. A rapid run for it was successfully made, with some loss under a heavy fire, but about 2/3 of what was left of the brigade were rallied on the ridge, and were soon joined by the remnants of the Ala and Miss brigades. Manigault saved 2 of his guns, but 2 were captured. The enemy seemed contented with his success and did not pursue, and the firing ceased all along the line except at the extreme right, where Cleburne and the troops opposing Sherman still held their ground until withdrawn after dark. Considering how utterly the centre of his line was routed, Bragg made a surprisingly good retreat, the enemy not pursuing vigorously. Bragg crossed the Chickamauga that night, destroying the bridges behind him. On the 26th he retreated to Ringgold, where on the 27th he repulsed a pursuing force which then retired. The army then withdrew to Dalton, where 5 days later Bragg, at his own request, was relieved of the command. He lost his campaign primarily when he allowed Rosecrans to reopen the short line of his communications. Sending Longstreet to Knoxville while holding such advanced lines cannot be excused or palliated. It was a monumental failure to appreciate the glaring weakness of his position. His men never really fought, except against Sherman on his extreme right, and there they were victorious and retreated unmolested after night. He was simply marched out from his position on Lookout, and he would have been also marched off of Missionary Ridge by Hooker, had not Grant grown impatient. The unwise division of his forces had put it in Grant's power to defeat him by marching with at least 50% less than the usual fighting. Bragg's casualties were but 361 killed and 2160 wounded, about the average of a single corps or 1/6 of those at Chickamauga. But he lost 40 guns. Grant's losses were also but small, on Lookout Mountain and on Missionary Ridge. They were heaviest where Sherman attacked Cleburne's and Breckinridge's divisions, but even there, where the fighting was prolonged most of the day, there were no such casualties as there had been at Chickamauga. Grant's total was 753 killed, 4722 wounded, 349 missing. Total 5824. Livermore estimates the forces engaged on each side as follows. The Knoxville Campaign. On November 3, as has been told, Longstreet was ordered to march against Burnside in E10, with McLaws's and Hood's divisions of infantry, Alexander's and Layden's battalions of artillery, of 23 and 12 guns, and 5 brigades of cavalry under Wheeler, with 12 guns. This force numbered about 15,000, of which about 5,000 were cavalry and 10,000 infantry and artillery. Cooperation was promised from southwest Veigh, by a force of about 4,000 under Ransom, but it was too late in starting, and its infantry and artillery only reached Longstreet on his retreat northward after the siege of Knoxville. It was designed to move Longstreet by rail from Chattanooga to Sweetwater 10, within 40 miles of Knoxville. This, it was hoped, could be easily done by the 7th or 8th. The artillery and McLaws's division were marched to Tyner's Station on November 4, and Hood's division to the tunnel through Missionary Ridge on the night of the 5th. Trains, however, could only be furnished to carry them to Sweetwater by the 12th, and it was the night of the 14th before a pontoon bridge could be thrown across the river at Huff's Ferry near London, and the advance upon Knoxville, 29 miles off, actively undertaken. The men and guns of my own battalion were carried on a train of flat cars on the 10th, the train taking over 12 hours to make the 60 miles. The cannoneers were required to pump water for the engine and to cut up fence rails for fuel along the route, and the horses were driven by the roads. The forces of Burnside at Knoxville consisted of 4 small divisions, 2 of the 9th Corps and 2 of the 23rd, about 12,000 infantry and artillery, and 8,500 cavalry. The cavalry, during the coming siege, for the most part held the south side of the river, where they erected strong works on the commanding hills and were little molested, as our own cavalry was generally kept on the north bank on our left flank. Burnside was ordered not to oppose Longstreet's advance, but to retreat before him and draw him on, as far as possible, from Chattanooga. On Sunday, November 15, Longstreet crossed and advanced as far as Lenoir's, Burnside falling back, skirmishing. On the 16th, an effort was made to bring him to battle at Campbell's Station, but only a skirmish resulted, in which the Federal loss was 31 killed, 211 wounded, and 76 missing, and the Confederates 22 killed, 152 wounded. Burnside withdrew into Knoxville that night, and Longstreet followed and drew up before it on November 17. On the 18th, the outposts were driven in and close reconnaissances made, in which the Federal General Sanders was killed. He had been recently promoted, was an officer of much promise, and a relative of President Davis. The reconnaissances developed the enemy holding a very strong defensive line with but a single weak point. This was the northwest salient angle where their north and south line running perpendicular. To the river below the town made a right angle, and turning to the east ran parallel with the river to the northeast of the town. There it rested, behind an extensive inundation of First Creek, upon a strong enclosed work on Temperance Hill, mounting 12 guns, with outlying works upon Maybreeze and Flint Hills. These had been built, with several other works, during the prior Confederate occupation, and one, enclosing 3 sides of a rectangle about 125 by 95 feet with bastion fronts, the rear being open, had been nearly completed at the northwest salient angle above referred to. This was now called Fort Sanders, after the general killed on the 18th, and every exertion was used to complete and strengthen it, all able-bodied inhabitants of the town being impressed, both white and black, to aid in labour upon the fortifications. The Confederate engineer who laid out this work had injudiciously turned the salient angle of its northwest bastion directly toward the valley of Third Creek, just at the point where this valley allowed an approach within 120 yards, completely covered from the fire of the fort. A convex crest of the valley curved from this point to the east and south, and sheltered a large territory, affording space for many brigades to be held completely under cover, within distances of from 150 to 400 yards of the enemy's entrenchments. These conditions made it the most favourable point for attack, and indeed the only one at all favourable north of the river. A third of the enemy's northern front was protected by inundations of First and Second Creeks, across which his guns had open sweep for a mile. To make a large circuit and turn it would be to abandon our communications with our base of supplies. An attack upon either of his short flanks running back to the river would be enfiladed from the south bank. 2 strong enclosed works, Fort Comstock and Battery Wiltsey, covered the only approach between the inundations. The theory of Longstreet's expedition was that he should take a much superior force and make short work of it. In fact, we had an inferior force of infantry and artillery, until after the arrival of Johnson's and Grade's brigades, which will be referred to presently. The cavalry on neither side took any part in the siege operations. We had now to take the offensive, which made the task harder, but yet we seem to have stood a fair chance to carry Fort Sanders had we made an attack with all our force soon after our arrival. But every day of delay added to the strength of the enemy's breastworks, and in a very few days he had an interior line which might have successfully resisted, even had Fort Sanders been captured. It is now to tell how the 10 days were consumed, which were allowed to intervene before the attack. By that time a second line had been constructed, which might or might not have survived the loss of the first. The 20th saw our own line finished with batteries erected to repel any offensive movements of the enemy, and, incidentally, enfilade some of the lines of Fort Sanders, which was already recognised as the most feasible point of attack. Had the advantage of an early attack been fully realised, it might have been organised and delivered on the 21st, or at latest by the 22nd. But on that day, one of our staff officers, who had crossed the Holston River on our right flank and reconnoitred the country, had found it possible to locate a battery upon a high hill close to the river, giving an advantageous line of fire upon Fort Sanders at a distance of 2,400 yards. Longstreet directed this to be done, and the attack postponed for it. A flat boat and some wire were procured, a ferry fixed up, Law's and Robertson's brigades of infantry and Parker's rifle battery was crossed, and by working all night of the 24th, it was possible by noon of the 25th to report as ready to open an enfilade fire on Fort Sanders. But the loss of this time and the transfer of this infantry and artillery to the south side of the river were both ill-advised. Our rifle ammunition was defective in quality, our supply of it was quite limited, and the range was too great for effective work under such conditions. Longstreet felt too the need of the 2 brigades sent across the river, and hearing of the coming of Bushrod Johnson's and Gracie's brigades, he decided to await their arrival, expected the night of the 26th. They brought an effective force of about 2,600 men, but they did not actually arrive until the night of the 28th, and were not able to render any service. That night Longstreet was joined by General Ledbetter, Bragg's chief engineer, who had been at Knoxville during the Confederate occupation, and being the oldest military engineer in the Confederate service, was supposed to be the most efficient. He was a graduate of West Point of 1836, the class ahead of Bragg's. Coming to Longstreet, as he did, with the prestige of being on the staff of the commanding general, and especially charged with the decision of all questions of military engineering, it is perhaps not strange that Longstreet was quick to adopt his suggestions, and these, it will be seen, robbed him of most of his few remaining chances of victory. On Thursday, the 26th, the attack having already been postponed to await the arrival of Johnson's brigades, Ledbetter and Longstreet rode on a reconnaissance around the enemy's entire position. Ledbetter pronounced Fort Sanders to be assailable, but expressed a preference for an attack upon Mabry's Hill. This was the enemy's extreme right flank, and was undoubtedly the strongest portion of his whole line, besides being the farthest removed and the most inaccessible. In fact, our own pickets had been advanced but little beyond Second Creek, and Ledbetter's opinion was based upon very imperfect and distant views. It was therefore determined to drive in the enemy's pickets and make a better reconnaissance on Friday the 27th. Meanwhile, so certain was Ledbetter of the advantage of a change in the point of attack that Parker's battery was ordered to be withdrawn from the south side of the Holston on Thursday night. On Friday, the cavalry was called on to drive in the enemy's pickets, and Longstreet and Ledbetter, accompanied by the leading generals, made a thorough reconnaissance of our left flank. The attack upon Mabry's Hill was unanimously pronounced impossible, Ledbetter himself concurring. On the way back, the party stopped opposite Fort Sanders, and while watching it with glasses, saw a man cross the ditch in front of the northwest salient, showing the depth of it at that point as less than 5 feet. This encouraged a hope that the ditch of the fort would not be found a formidable obstacle, and as there was now no alternative, and Ledbetter was urgent against further delay, the attack was ordered at noon on the 28th, this time being necessary to return Parker's battery to its enfilading position on the south side, whence Ledbetter had had it withdrawn the night before. At noon the next day all was ready, but the day was rainy and very unfavourable for artillery practice, so Longstreet again decided to postpone the attack until the next morning, the 29th. Some howitzers had been raised upon skids so as to permit fire with small charges at high elevations, as mortars, in order to probe behind the parapets of the fort. It had been ordered that the opening of these mortars should be the signal for the advance of a large number of skirmishers, who should occupy the enemy's rifle pits within 120 to 250 yards of the fort, enveloping completely its north and west fronts and keeping down the fire, either from its embrasures or parapets. After some practice by the mortars and the sharpshooters, the mortars would suspend and allow the rifled guns and others to fire to get their ranges. When all had gotten ranges, a rapid fire by both guns and mortars, 34 in all, would begin, concentrated upon the fort as long as seemed necessary. Its cessation would be the signal for the advance of the storming force of 2 brigades in columns of regiments, supported by adjacent brigades upon the flanks. If the passage of the ditch was found difficult, the pioneers with spade and picks were expected to rapidly cut small steps in the slopes which would enable the men to swarm over. The sharpshooters and the storming column itself could be relied upon to keep down the fire of the fort on the men in the ditches while this was being done. The garrison of the fort, as afterward shown, did not exceed 220, including the artillery, and could be overpowered as quickly as they could be reached. It is now to show how all preparations were thrown away and all advantages sacrificed for the elusive merits of a night attack, decided upon by Longstreet after dark on the 28th. Ledbetter was spending the night with him, but whether he suggested or acquiesced was never disclosed. About 9 p.m. that night I received notice that the plan of attack would be changed, and that neither the rifles across the river, the howitzers rigged as mortars, nor any other of the 34 guns arranged to fire on the fort would be used, except to fire a signal. Several days had been spent in preparation for a cannonade, with all our guns concentrated on the small area enclosed by the fort, and now it was all to be given up as well as all to be hoped for from the fire by daylight of a half-mile of sharpshooters within from 120 to 250 yards. The fort had no embrasure on its west front, and its fire would have to be over the parapets and much exposed. The advance was intended to be a surprise, and the signal guns were ordered to be fired just before dawn, that the approach of the column might not be visible. There was little time for consultation, for it was ordered that at moonrise, about 10 p.m., the enemy's picket line should be taken and occupied by our sharpshooters, and the troops should be under arms. Soon after 10 p.m., there was a general advance by our picket lines on both sides of Fort Sanders, and after some 2 hours of sharp fighting, 50 or 60 prisoners had been taken, the enemy's pit occupied, and they did not have out a picket 20 yards from the fort. Lieutenant Benjamin, commanding, feeling sure that the attack would be at daylight, required every man to sleep at his post, and 1 in every 4 to keep awake as a sentry. During the night, an occasional gun was fired with canister or shell at random from the fort. Federal accounts state that our own artillery was also fired during the night, but this is a mistake. Our own troops were being moved and would have been endangered by such a fire. At the earliest sign of light in eastern sky, 3 successive guns fired from different batteries gave the signal to the sharpshooters to open fire and for the storming columns to advance. Their shells were visible like meteors in the air, and they exploded high above the fort. For a few minutes about a dozen guns poured a hot fire on the fort and into the angle of the lines behind it. This was intended only to encourage the storming columns, and was discontinued in a few minutes. At once the sharpshooters opened their fire upon the parapet, and orders were given the storming columns to move. It had been intended that these should be formed close behind the sharpshooters, within 150 to 200 yards of the fort, but in the darkness this had not been done. The columns each had several hundred yards to go, and Johnson's and Grade's brigades, ordered up in support, had from 800 to 1,000. The storming column was composed of Wofford's Gay Brigade, 4 regiments under Colin Ruff on the left, and of 2 regiments of Humphreys's Miss, and 3 of Bryan's Gay Brigade on the right. Anderson's Gay Brigade was ordered to support the storming column on the left by an attack on the lines beyond the fort on that side. As the 2 columns advanced on converging lines, they presently ran into an entanglement of telegraph wires stretched between stumps which threw down the leading les and caused a little delay. But these were soon torn away, and with very little loss. 2 or 3 shots each were fired from a barbette gun in the salient, and from an embrasure in the northeast bastion, but with the arrival of the men at the ditch, the artillery fire was silenced. The 2 columns were soon found to have converged in the darkness too much, and being already deep columns, one of 4 lines and one of 5, they simply coalesced in the darkness into a mass whose officers could no longer separate or distinguish their own men. To this mass was presently added Anderson's brigade, ordered to carry the breastworks east of the fort. Through some mistake, some minutes later, they came in from the left in 2 lines, where already 9 lines were crowding each other. The ditch was found to be from 4 to 8 feet deep and about 12 feet in width, without any berm at the top of the counterscarp, and with steep sides rendered slippery by freezing weather and the rain of the previous day. Yet many officers and men were able to cross the ditch and scale the parapet, but not in such numbers as to overcome the 150 infantry defending the fort with fine tenacity. A few shells were lighted by Lieutenant Benjamin and thrown by hand into the ditch as hand grenades, and axes and billets of wood were thrown over the parapets. Laut Cumming, Adjos of the 16th Gay, made his way through an embrasure with 12 men, but the party was captured inside. Colin Thomas of the same regiment was killed in the ditch, as was also Col McElroy of the 13th Miss. Laut Colchief Pfizer of the 17th lost his arm on the parapet, and Col Ruff, commanding Wofford's brigade, was killed on the counterscarp. Meanwhile, fully 20 minutes elapsed, and daylight began to make things dimly visible. Nearly 200 men had gotten into the ditch, and not finding it easy to advance, now preferred to surrender. The fire from the fort had ceased except an occasional musket fired over the parapet, exposing only a hand of the man holding it. But at a point 500 yards to the south of the fort, an offset 200 yards long, running nearly west from the Federal breastworks, gave a fair enfilade fire upon the crowd of men along the counterscarp of the west front of the fort, and from this point the increasing daylight was bringing a fire which rapidly multiplied the casualties. Longstreet, about this time, was advancing with the brigades of Johnson and Gracie, with those of Jenkins and Benning upon the left, when he received an exaggerated report of the wire entanglement which had been first encountered. Without a second thought, Longstreet ordered the recall. Johnson begged to be allowed to go on, as also did Jenkins, but Longstreet, giving full faith to the report, forbade. It is certain that after a little delay the attack would have been renewed, being preceded by a cannonade, and with a storming column provided with tools to cut steps in the scarp and parapet. But within a half hour a staff officer of Ransom's arrived with a telegram from President Davis, by way of Bristol Vassay, telling of Bragg's defeat on Missionary Ridge on the 25th, and ordering Longstreet to march to join Bragg at Dalton. Vague rumours of this had reached Longstreet the night before, but had not been credited, and had rather confirmed his intention to attack. Very soon after this, Burnside sent out a flag and offered us a truce to remove our dead and wounded, which Longstreet accepted, all thought of renewal of the attack being abandoned. The truce was later extended until dark, Longstreet at first proposing to retreat southward at night to join Bragg, but during the day messages arrived from that direction, and we learned of the approach of a force under Sherman to relieve Burnside, and that our road to Dalton was closed. The roads through Upper Gar were deemed impracticable for an army and destitute of supplies, so it was determined to retreat toward southwest Veii. But, in order to relieve the pressure upon Bragg as far as we could, Longstreet determined to maintain a threatening position before Knoxville until the approaching Federal reinforcements were within a day's march. This was done, and on the night of December 4, in a severe rainstorm, the retreat began. During the night and next morning we made 18 miles and encamped at Blaine's Cross Roads, where we met Ransom's artillery and infantry coming to help us in the attack upon Knoxville, but nearly 3 weeks late. Having retreated nearly to Rogersville, 65 miles, by the 9th, on the 14th we returned to Bean Station to attack a force under Park, which had followed us from Knoxville. Sending 2 brigades of cavalry on the flanks to cut off the enemy's retreat, Longstreet advanced his whole force directly on Bean Station. The enemy's skirmishers were met about 3 miles in front with artillery, but were driven in by Gracie's brigade. Gracie was wounded in the skirmish. The Federal line was formed just in rear of the town, with a large hotel building on the edge of the town strongly held by sharpshooters, firing from loopholes in the 2nd and 3rd stories. Parker's battery was advanced within 350 yards of the hotel, which was soon charged by Gracie's brigade and taken possession of. Meanwhile, Kershaw's brigade had turned the left flank of the enemy's line, and 4 more batteries had been advanced to close ranges, when it was found that the enemy was withdrawing in the dusk, which was now rapidly obscuring the field. The day was a short one and cloudy. The infantry had marched 16 miles over bad roads, and Longstreet feared that in the darkness his troops might fire into each other. The enemy were mainly cavalry under Shackelford, and pursuit at night by our infantry would be bootless. So the artillery held its fire, and the infantry went into bivouac. The affair had been bloody for its duration, and our side had the worst of it. It is needless to give further details of the retreat. The campaign had been one of much hardship. Some facts may be given showing how poorly we were provided, even with prime necessities, though we were in our own country. We were so deficient in horseshoes that on the advance to Knoxville we stripped the shoes and saved the nails from all dead horses, killing for the purpose all wounded and broken-down animals, both our own and those left behind by the enemy. During the siege, the river brought down a number of dead animals thrown in within the town. We watched for these, took them out, and stripped their feet of shoes and nails. Our men were nearly as badly off for footgear as our animals. I have seen bloody stains left on frozen ground where our infantry had passed. In the artillery we took the shoes from the feet of the drivers to give to the cannoneers who had to march. Our rations were also frequently not even the reduced rations now issued to the whole army. Corn, unground, was often the only ration. Longstreet's retreat was now continued without serious engagement to Morristown and later to Greenville, where he wintered, and rejoined Lee at Gordonsville Var in the spring. The following table gives the Confederate casualties of the campaign. Those of the unfortunate assault on Fort Sanders, badly begun, suspended by mistake, and never concluded, are shown separately below. Chapter 20. Battle of the Wilderness. Lee honoured our return to his command with a review. It was the only one ever held after the one in the Shenandoah Valley in October 1862. He was not given to parades merely for show. Now, doubtless, he felt and reciprocated the stirrings of affection in the hearts of his men, inseparable from our return from bloody Chickamauga, upon the eve of what all felt must be the struggle to a finish, and no one who was present can ever forget the occasion. It took place in a cleared valley with broad pastures, in which our 2 divisions of infantry, with my old battalion of artillery, could be deployed, not far from Mechanicsburg, where we were encamped some 6 or 8 miles south of Gordonsville. It is now over 40 years, but in imagination I can see today the large square gateposts without gate or fence, for troops had been everywhere in that vicinity, marking where a country road led out of a tall oak wood upon an open knoll in front of the centre of our long double lines. And as the well-remembered figure of Lee upon Traveller, at the head of his staff, rides between the posts and comes out upon the ground, the bugle sounds a signal, the guns thunder out a salute, Lee reins up Traveller and bares his good grey head and looks at us, and we give the rebel yell and shout and cry and wave our flags and look at him once more. For a wave of sentiment, something like what came a year later at Appomattox when he rode back from his meeting with Grant, seemed to sweep over the field. All felt the bond which held them together. There was no speaking. but the effect was as of a military sacrament. Dr. Boggs, a SC chaplain riding with the staff, said to Colin Venable, Lee's aide, "Does not it make the general proud to see how these men love him?" Venable answered, "Not proud, it awes him." He rode along our lines close enough to look into our faces, and then we marched in review and went back to our camps. Our narrative may pause for a bird's-eye view of the situation. In all previous campaigns there had been intermission for refreshment between our battles, in which the armies would replenish and recruit before initiating new strategy leading up to a new collision, usually under a new federal leader. Now from May 5th, when battle was joined in the Wilderness, until April 9th, 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, there was scarcely a day when the armies were not under each other's fire. Grant decided beforehand not to exchange prisoners. This added much to the suffering to be endured on both sides. It may be condoned as tending to shorten the war, but the way in which it was done savoured more of the sharp trick than of Grant's usual dignity and frankness of character. We had, perhaps unwisely, outlawed Butler, and Grant's trick consisted in making him Commissioner for Exchange of Prisoners, in hopes that we would decline to hold communication with him. When we swallowed our pride and offered exchanges, pretences were found to still refuse. The campaign against us was practically to be one of extermination, and it was to be conducted by 4 separate armies and as much of the navy as could be used in the James River. First, Grant had 4 corps, the 2d, 5th, 6th and 9th, and a large force of cavalry. His returns show 102,869 present for duty with 242 guns. Besides, there was a siege train being prepared of 106 guns and mortars, among which were 6 100 PR rifles. This train came into service in May and June. The cavalry were all armed with Spencer carbines, the first magazine guns ever used by the army. They fully doubled the efficiency of the cavalry against ours, with only muzzle loaders. Wilder's mounted infantry had had them at Chickamauga, and their value on that occasion has been told. Brigades of them soon began to appear among the Federal infantry, as will appear hereafter. It was useless to capture these guns, as we could not supply the brass cartridges required. Second, in the Shenandoah Valley, Sigel was preparing a force of about 15,000 men with 40 guns, which was to move upon Staunton. Third, from W. Vaker, Crook also was to move upon Staunton with about 9,000 men and 24 guns. When Crook and Sigel had united, they were to move upon Lynchburg and thence upon Richmond. Fourth, Butler, at Fortress Monroe, was organizing the Army of the James to move upon Richmond by its south bank. It would be escorted by 4 monitors, a fleet of gunboats, and a large collection of ferryboats and river craft of every description. These would facilitate all movements by water. His force comprised the 10th and 18th Corps, and Coutz's cavalry, 30,000 men with 79 guns, of which about 5,000 were cavalry. Besides these 4 armies, there were, near Washington, about 40,000 troops which were used for reinforcements during the next 2 months, besides a constant stream of recruits from all over the North, stimulated by bounties now being paid of $1,000 per man, and, early in July, Grant also brought around from New Orleans the 19th Corps, about 12,000 men. There were no returns of Longstreet's corps after his return from E10, but he gives as a liberal estimate 10,000 men. The return of the rest of the Army of Northern Virginia, on April 20th, was as follows. Adding 10,000 for Longstreet, Lee's total force was about 64,000, and he had about 274 guns. Against the armies of Sigel and Crook, Breckinridge was able to muster in the valley and in the SW about 9,000 men and 24 guns. To meet Butler, Beauregard brought to Petersburg, from various points in the south, troops which he organized into 4 divisions, comprising about 22,000 infantry, 2,000 cavalry, and about 50 guns. These included Pickett's division of Longstreet's corps, say 5,000 men, which rejoined Longstreet about June 1st, and Johnson's brigade of Early's division, which was returned to the division on May 6th. To recapitulate, the forces under Grant's command were about 150,000 men, and those under Lee's were about 95,000. Grant's strategic decision. Grant had been urged by some of his advisers to transfer his army to the James and to make his advance upon Richmond by that line, by which he could approach within 20 miles without the loss of a man. But he wisely held that his objective was Lee's army, and that it could most easily be reached in a half-day's march from his camps at Culpeper. Positioning of Longstreet's Corps. A word about our position, where Longstreet's corps was to await Grant's opening the campaign. It was at Mechanicsburg, about 6 miles south of Gordonsville. Lee was fully aware that Grant's first move would be an attempt to turn his right flank, which would bring him through the wilderness, and had decided to attack him en route. Ewell's corps, from its camps in winter quarters, could reach Grant's probable route by a march of 18 miles. Hill's corps was farther to the left and would have about 28 miles to go. Longstreet's, from Mechanicsburg, would have a somewhat later start, and 30 miles in an airline, which proved to be 42 by the country roads used to avoid interference with Hill's route. Tactical decisions and movement. The first day would offer us the best chances, as Grant would have no breastworks and could use little artillery in the wilderness. What proved a drawn battle, begun by 3 divisions, reinforced by 2 after 6 hours and by 3 more after 18 hours, might have had a different result if begun by 5 and reinforced by 2 after 6 hours, and only one left, Anderson's, to come in after 18 hours. This might have been the history if Longstreet's corps had been located a few miles north of Louisa C.H. instead of at Mechanicsburg. Command assignments and preparation. Majmuch General Field had now been assigned to the command of Hood's division, and Kershaw had been promoted to the command of McLaws's. I had been made Chief of Artillery of the Corps, and the 2 battalions, Cabell's and Henry's, now Haskell's, which had been left in Var. When we went to Chickamauga, rejoined us. Col Frank Huger succeeded to the command of my old battalion. Commencement of the campaign. It was near midday on May 4th when the news came that Grant was crossing the Rapidan at Ely's and Germanna fords, with orders from Lee to march to Todd's Tavern on the Brock Road, the road by which Jackson on May 2, 1863, had turned Hooker's position. At 4 p.m. we were on the way, with orders to march all night, only stopping to feed and water. We kept it up until near sundown the next day, when the 2 divisions went into bivouac near Craig's Meeting House on the Carthapin Road, having travelled about 36 miles. We were ordered to cook, eat and rest until 1 a.m., and then start for Todd's Tavern. Before starting, orders came from Lee to come across to the plank road at Parker's store, about 6 miles.